Welcome to Drop of Water. Have you ever wondered if the long-held story of the death of one of England's greatest queens was a lie that had been meticulously covered up for centuries? Did the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I really die peacefully? Or was there a shocking secret buried for 400 years? Elizabeth I, also known as the Virgin Queen, is a legend. During her 45-year reign, she ruled with an iron fist, guiding England through storms, defeating the mighty Spanish Armada, and transforming the island nation into a global power. But perhaps everything we thought we knew about her death in March 1603 at Richmond Palace was a lie that had been meticulously concealed for decades. Join us as we uncover the terrifying mystery of Elizabeth I's haunting final days, uncovering strange behavior, conflicting testimony, and hastily erased evidence to uncover the most shocking truth about her death. Welcome to a story that'll change the way you think about one of England's greatest queens. The official record is that Elizabeth died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her loyal servants, a gentle death worthy of a great monarch. But if you dig a little deeper, you will begin to notice cracks in that perfect picture. There are witnesses who give conflicting testimony. Important evidence suddenly and mysteriously disappears. And most suspiciously, some of those present that night keep changing their stories. Could it be that behind the velvet curtain of this historic event, there is a truth that those in power at the time tried to bury forever? Join me as we travel back in time to the final days of Elizabeth, when an elaborate historical cover-up begins to unfold before our very eyes. It is not just the story of a queen's death, but an elaborate drama, where every character plays their part to keep a shocking secret hidden. There will be details that will make you shudder, questions that will make you question everything you have been taught in books. Is what we have been told just the tip of the iceberg, hiding a much more shocking truth? We will discover why the most powerful people want this story to remain in the dark forever. Was Elizabeth I's death not a natural event, but the result of a carefully calculated plot? The death of a king or queen is always a momentous event, riveting the attention of the entire realm. But Elizabeth's death is shrouded in an unusual mystery. The hasty handling of the body, the lack of an independent autopsy, and conflicting claims about her last words are all pieces of a larger, more terrifying picture. The Queen's wig situation was even more dramatic. Elizabeth owned more than 80 wigs, each more elaborate than the last. This was because by the age of 60 she was almost completely bald. Courtiers whispered that her natural hair had fallen out after years of lead poisoning. The same makeup that had slowly killed her was also destroying her appearance. Together, we will piece together the puzzle, shining a light on the hidden corners that official history has deliberately ignored. Prepare yourself to encounter a completely different side of Queen Elizabeth I, not the inviolable symbol of power, but a woman struggling with illness, old age, and perhaps even intrigued within her own court. This story will not only take you through Elizabeth's final days, but will also reveal the truth behind her death, a truth that has been hidden for 400 years. Are you ready to discover the shocking truth about Queen Elizabeth I? By 1603, when Elizabeth was 67, an age considered ancient by Tudor standards, she was still struggling to hide any signs of weakness. For a monarch like her, admitting weakness would have been tantamount to signing her own death warrant. So she created the most elaborate deception in royal history. Every morning, servants spent hours applying a thick mask of white lead mixed with vinegar to her face, not figuratively but actually conversing with painted versions of herself from decades past. Servants reported that they would regularly find her at 3 a.m. standing in front of a portrait from her coronation, asking it for advice. Her hands shook so much that she could not sign documents without assistance. Yet in public she maintained the illusion of power through carefully choreographed performances. Every gesture was meticulously real. She began wearing gloves all the time because her fingernails had turned black. Witnesses described them as dead-looking and frighteningly dark. The toxic mixture not only covered up the scars from smallpox that had ravaged her skin decades earlier, but also maintained her proud Virgin Queen look. Her teeth were blackened by sugar addiction, but they were cleverly hidden behind pursed-lip smiles or strategically positioned in audiences so they would not be seen. But then something strange began to happen. The Queen began to talk to her portraits. By 1602, Elizabeth's inner circle was essentially running a psychological operation. They tightly controlled who saw her, when, and under what lighting conditions. Throughout her 45-year reign, her refusal to name an heir was a political genius, turning uncertainty into a weapon to hold on to power. Robert Cecil, her chancellor, corresponded secretly with James VI of Scotland. Supporters of the Earl of Essex, still bitter over his execution 2 years earlier, whispered about alternative candidates. They forged documents, intercepted correspondence, and eliminated potential troublemakers, all while pretending to serve a queen who was rapidly losing control of reality. By early 1603, England was no longer truly ruled by Elizabeth. She began ordering servants to move specific paintings around the palace on a daily basis, claiming that they were looking at her the wrong way or judging her choices. She would only eat food prepared by a particular chef, and even then she required that each dish be tasted first. She then selected these tasters from a rotating group of courtiers whom she suspected of A 1602 inventory showed that she had her own portraits moved 47 times in a single month. She was obsessed with rearranging her own image. It was being run by a small group of men desperately trying to prevent the kingdom from imploding as she took her last breath. It was a race against time, as ultimate power slowly slipped from the Queen's hands, falling into a spiral of intrigue and intrigue. Catholic nobles saw this as an opportunity to restore their faith to the throne. It all started with her sleeping habits. She refused to lie down in bed, insisting on sleeping standing up, propped up against pillows against the wall. When asked why, she replied mysteriously, "If I lie down, I will never get up again." But servants reported that they often found her in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, conversing with invisible people. Foreign kings, ambitious nobles, even her own parliament, all were kept guessing. Will she marry? Will she adopt? Will she finally point to someone and say, "You're next"? This ambiguity had given her ultimate power. But by 1603, it was about to tear England apart. The Virgin Queen had become a carefully maintained illusion, and cracks were beginning to show. Medical records from the period, which were thoroughly cleaned up, make no mention of these details, suggesting a clear attempt to conceal the true state of the Queen's health. The facade of splendor and invulnerability she had so painstakingly constructed was crumbling, and only those closest to her were witnessing the real moments of a weakened Elizabeth. This created a veil of mystery, and one wonders whether her own weakness had paved the way for the unusual events that would follow. Yet while Elizabeth struggled with her physical and mental breakdowns, an even greater political storm was brewing. Behind the palace doors, courtiers began to choose sides, like vultures circling a dying animal. Elizabeth knew exactly what was going on, and she seems to have relished the drama. At her last Christmas court in 1602, she is said to have told the French ambassador, "I may not be here next Christmas, but England will survive the chaos." KOC insisted, not England will survive. She knew her death would trigger a succession crisis, and part of her seemed to enjoy the drama. The Spanish were mobilizing in the Netherlands, ready to back any Catholic claimant to the throne. The Scottish border was being fortified as James prepared for either a peaceful succession or a military intervention. Merchants in London were hoarding gold, anticipating civil war. In it, Elizabeth's most trusted advisors essentially ran a shadowed government, making decisions she either didn't want or couldn't make. In the last months of her life, Elizabeth's behavior became so strange that courtiers began whispering about her being possessed by a demon. Her obsession with portraits escalated beyond simply talking to them. Then came the food paranoia. Elizabeth, who had always eaten sparingly, began to refuse meals altogether, not because of illness, but because she feared being poisoned. Her ladies-in-waiting noted increasingly erratic behavior. She would spend hours staring at her hands, claiming she could see the traces of time moving across them like shadows. For 20 minutes, the most powerful monarch in Europe swayed and twirled while her horrified court watched in silence. When she finally stopped, she looked around in confusion and asked, "Why is everyone staring at me?" Her inner circle began implementing what they called management protocols, essentially treating their queen like a dangerous patient who needed constant supervision. Some say she spoke of being alone in death, while others claim she uttered some cryptic phrase about my crown or the power of God. 8 hours. In an age when news traveled slowly, that was enough time for anything to happen behind closed palace doors. Why the delay? Courtiers claimed it was to prepare for the succession and to deliver the news in an orderly manner. This suggests that information about the Queen's condition, and possibly the plan surrounding her death, had leaked out, even to her enemies. Robert Cecil, with his shrewd mind and masterful political manipulation, was the architect of this coup. He had everything ready. Documents were written in advance, statements were prepared, and a media plan was drawn up to ensure that the story of the Queen's death was presented in the most favorable light to the new rulers. Every personal item, private document, or anything that might provide clues about her final condition was thoroughly removed. It was like a crime scene being cleaned. Key witnesses who might have seen or heard something unusual were also quickly dispatched elsewhere or kept silent in various ways. All of these fragments paint a picture of a mysterious death, one that those in power did everything they could to make it look like a perfect lie. Elizabeth's personal physician, John Dee, a mysterious and learned figure, died suddenly shortly after the Queen. She had suddenly changed her story, and it was no coincidence that her family had received considerable favors from the new court. Had a deal been struck? Had silence been bought with power and money? This raised serious questions about the veracity of the information being published. Although the official reason was illness, the timing of the departure of someone who could have known so much about the Queen's true health and the substances to which she was exposed certainly raised many questions. However, many whispered that it was time needed to stage the scene, collect evidence, and prepare a consistent story for the public. Immediately after the death was confirmed, the Queen's body was hastily removed, without an independent autopsy. This was not in keeping with normal royal protocol, where every death of a monarch is thoroughly investigated. This inconsistency raises the suspicion that no one really knows exactly what Elizabeth said, or, more importantly, that a unified account was created to fit some narrative. These signs were clear signs of an undeniable decline, and raised major questions about the Queen's ability to make important decisions on her own, or whether she had become a pawn in the hands of others. She began hoarding small objects, buttons, coins, scraps of fabric, hiding them throughout her rooms like a magpie. A catch-all phrase, convenient and a powerful queen, despite her age, died of melancholy. It seemed too simple, almost a concoction to cover up something more complex. And then, another chilling detail. Elizabeth's bedroom windows were found wide open, despite her obsessive desire to keep them closed for fear of being poisoned or attacked. Who opened them, and why? Official history declared that Queen Elizabeth I had died peacefully at Richmond Palace. Cecil claimed that Elizabeth had designated James VI of Scotland as her successor with a sign. Lady Scrope, however, claimed that the Queen was no longer able to speak, only able to nod weakly. These two accounts are in marked conflict. One says there was a will, the other says there was not. Why such a huge difference at such a pivotal moment in history? Was one of them deliberately distorting the truth, or were both forced to do so? But we will dissect the small details, the strange contradictions in eyewitness accounts, to see that her death was not as simple as what is recorded. Most disturbing were her nighttime wanderings. Guards would report finding her in the palace gardens at 2 a.m., dressed only in her nightgown, searching for something she couldn't explain. When questioned, she would say she was searching for her younger self or trying to find where her happiness had been. The tipping point came in February 1603. During a routine court session, Elizabeth suddenly stood up and began dancing alone to music that only she could hear. On March 24, 1603, the whole of England held its breath. First, consider the testimony of two key figures, Robert Cecil, the powerful Lord Chancellor, and Lady Scrope, one of the Queen's closest ladies. Then there are Elizabeth's last words. At least 3 different versions have circulated, but the most disturbing detail was the 8-hour gap between the Queen's supposed death and the official announcement to the public. The official reason given for Elizabeth's death was old age and melancholy. Finally, a letter from the Spanish ambassador, written days before Elizabeth's death was announced, accurately predicted her death and the succession. As soon as Elizabeth breathed her last, or at least as soon as the news of her death was officially confirmed, a swift and massive cover-up was launched. The first suspicious thing was the convenient disappearance of several important figures. Then there was Lady Scrope, one of the Queen's closest maids, who had initially recounted the Queen's contradictory last words. Elizabeth's private rooms at Richmond Palace were immediately cleared of all truth. There was even a blatant anachronism in the official announcement of the Queen's death. The time given differed from the actual time witnesses recorded her passing. But was it all just a desperate attempt to maintain the stability of the kingdom, or was there a darker motive behind the cover-up of a Queen's death? This question brings us to our final theory, one that may be even more horrifying than anything we've discussed so far. A small discrepancy, but enough to create a void of unanswered questions. There are 3 much more horrifying theories, each with its own dark, macabre undertone. Elizabeth's Protestant Reformation created powerful enemies, especially among the radical Puritans, who saw her death as a God-given opportunity to install a king who adhered to their teachings on the throne. When Elizabeth's body was finally seen by independent witnesses a few days later, it showed signs of rapid decomposition, which would not be consistent with a natural death, but it was consistent with certain poisons known to Renaissance assassins. The Spanish ambassador's prophetic letter becomes even more sinister when you realize that he not only predicted Elizabeth's death, but also described specific details about how the succession would be handled. This suggests that foreign intelligence agencies knew exactly what was planned. Some evidence suggests that a faction led by radical Puritans may have hastened her death in order to install a more pious king on the throne. Her death was not just the end of an era, it was also a masterclass in how to assassinate a queen and get away with it. The story of Queen Elizabeth I's final days is more than history. It is a mystery, a whisper of power, deception, and a death whose full truth we may never know. The mysterious 8-hour gap between her death and the official announcement may have been the time needed to stage the crime and remove the evidence. And to distract the public from these questions, a lavish, unprecedented funeral was held for Queen Elizabeth. Coded letters between Robert Cecil and his associates have been and they contain disturbing phrases about ending the Queen's suffering. Historians still debate the exact meaning of these words, but given that Elizabeth was facing a complete mental breakdown and was well aware of the succession crisis that her death would cause, is it possible that she chose to end her own life, and that those close to her assisted her to ensure a peaceful transfer of power? It's a terrifying thought, but one that cannot be completely ruled out given the circumstances. This flamboyant display was intended to unify the nation, reassure the public, and, most importantly, silence any whispers of a suspicious death. By tightly controlling information, manipulating testimony, and suppressing evidence, those behind the cover-up succeeded in crafting an official narrative that history has accepted for centuries. So, what really killed Elizabeth I? After looking at the conflicting evidence and the massive we can't just accept that simple old age and gloom explanation. The first theory, Elizabeth was slowly poisoned. Think of the toxic white lead makeup she wore daily for decades. Lead and mercury, the main ingredients in cosmetics at the time, not only damaged her skin but also accumulated in her body, causing symptoms of mental deterioration, tremors, and hallucinations, symptoms that the Queen clearly exhibited in her final days. Additionally, the discovery of a secret room in Richmond Palace, where Elizabeth died, filled with small vials of poison, adds a chilling twist to this theory. Did she accidentally poison herself in an effort to maintain her beauty and power? Or worse, did someone take advantage of her habit to hasten her death? The second, more daring theory is that Elizabeth committed suicide with assistance. And finally, the most terrifying theory. Elizabeth was murdered by religious extremists within her own court. Here is the detail that keeps historians up at night. Perhaps most frightening of all, if Elizabeth, Europe's most powerful monarch, could be so effectively eliminated that the truth remained buried for centuries, who else in history has suffered a similar fate?